This video module will describe the steps used to rig a Boeing 757 passenger door. The procedures used in this module are found in Chapter 25, Section 66, and Chapter 52, Section 11 of the Boeing Maintenance Manual. Consult these sections before attempting to rig an entry door. The module will demonstrate using door 1 left. Adjustments for doors 1 right, 2 left and right, and 4 left and right are similar. The adjustment procedure can be divided into 8 major steps: vertical positioning of the door, guide arm length adjustment, forward and aft positioning of the latch torque tubes, latch cam adjustment, door stop pins, upper and lower gate adjustment, centering guide, and guide arm preload check. 3 additional adjustments include the exterior handle mechanism, the emergency mechanism, and the girt bar mechanism. All door installation and adjustments must be done only when the airplane is on its landing gear. No rigging can be done with the airplane supported on jacks. To prepare for rigging, configure the aircraft as outlined in the maintenance manual. The first adjustment to be performed is the vertical position of the door in the opening. The objective is to obtain the skin gap requirements at the upper and lower gates and align stop pins on the door with stop pads on the fuselage. Remove or loosen the centering guide to prevent interference. Remove the stop pin retainer springs and back off all the door stop pins and close the door. Disengage the tab on the lock washer from the upper and lower lock nuts. Back off the upper lock nut at the lower hinge arm on the door torque tube. To obtain the required skin gaps at the upper and lower gates and stop pin alignment, tighten the lower lock nut to raise the door in the door cutout, or loosen the lower lock nut to lower the door. On new and replacement doors, excess skin material may be trimmed as necessary to obtain the required skin gaps at the sides of the door. Check that the stop pins are concentric within tolerance with respect to the stop pads before doing any trimming. When this adjustment is complete, tighten the upper lock nut. Lock a tab on each lock washer at the upper and lower lock nuts. The next adjustment is the guide arm assembly. Remove the shrink sleeve on the existing door to be re-rigged. If a new guide arm is to be installed, measure the length of the removed guide arm and set this length on the new guide arm. Slide a new heat shrink sleeve over the guide arm. Push the sleeve over the guide arm so that the jam nuts and adjacent rod will be accessible for adjustment. Do not shrink the sleeve at this time. Bolt the support bracket to the guide arm and tighten nut per maintenance manual. The guide arm cam follower pin with the spacer over each end is inserted into the cam plate tracks. The guide arm is moved by hand until the lower hinge link lug fits into the slot in the guide arm. Then the elbow pin is inserted and the securing spring installed. The gap Y between the end of the cam follower pin and the surface of the cam track must be equal within tolerance. If necessary, add a washer between the lower hinge link and the guide arm at the elbow pin to obtain equal gaps. Place the door in the cocked position and attach the support bracket to the serrated plate on the door hinge fitting, flush at the forward edge. Slowly close the door and check that the door is parallel to the body. If the latch cams are installed, check that the 2 top latch rollers on the door contact the latch cams on the body at the same time. If this condition is met, then no adjustment to the serrated plate is needed. If the forward latch roller is too close and the aft latch roller is too far from the latch cams, loosen the jam nuts and lengthen the guide arms slightly. Remove the bolts and move the support bracket forward 2 serrations. Repeat the check for simultaneous contact of the rollers to the cams. If the roller positions are just the opposite, and the forward latch roller is too far from the latch cam, shorten the guide arm slightly. Move the support bracket aft one serration and recheck for simultaneous contact. To avoid the possibility of preloading the guide arm during the initial adjustments, the guide arm must be checked periodically during the rigging for preload. The first check should be done at this time. Open the door to the cocked position and remove the nut at the guide arm bolt common to the support bracket. After closing and latching the door, try to move the 3/8" bolt up and down. If the bolt can be moved, the guide arm is not preloaded and the final guide arm length is set. If the bolt cannot be moved, loosen the jam nuts and adjust the length of the guide arm to eliminate the preload. Check again to be sure that the bolt can be moved, then tighten the jam nuts. The next adjustment is the door latch rollers. This controls the forward and aft position of the latch torque tubes. The objective is to obtain the proper latch roller engagement into the body-mounted latch cam at all 4 of the latch rollers. 2 dimensions are measured at each latch roller and body-mounted cam. The dimensions are called out as X and Y. To ensure latching without any gate preload, disconnect the upper and lower gate push rods from gate cranks by removing the bolt, washer, bushing, and nut. A note of caution: the disconnected push rods could damage the door structure while the door is being closed. Manually guide the disconnected push rods to prevent damage. Close the door. Check the fore and aft position of the latch torque tube by measuring the X gap between the face of the latch crank and the face of the body-mounted latch cam. These gaps should be equal within tolerance. Adjust the gaps as required by exchanging spacers between the forward and aft ends of the latch torque tube. One spacer thickness is equal to 24/1000ths of an inch. After the latch torque tube spacer locations have been finalized, orient the open ends of the horseshoe spacers randomly around the latch roller crank shaft, then inject BMS 5-95 sealant into the spaces between the spacers to keep them in place. A note of caution: be sure that the sealant does not prevent the ball bearings at the ends of the torque tubes from rotating. Measure and adjust the dimension Y as required by exchanging the washers between the roller side and the nut side of the latch roller crank. Tighten the nut to recommended torque value. Install the hardware to connect the gate push rods to the latch torque tubes. Leave the nuts and bolts finger tight until the gates have been adjusted. The next adjustment is to the 4 latch cams. The objectives are to obtain exterior skin flushness requirements and to prevent the roller from bottoming out on the body-mounted cam. First, check skin flushness to determine if any adjustment is necessary. Initially, locate the 4 latch cams so that the index hole in the cam will align with the index hole in the frame. Adjust the body-mounted latch cam on the serrated plates as needed to meet fair requirements at the top, bottom, and sides of the door. Bolt the latch cams and their serrated plates to the frame. After the final adjustment, 3 conditions should occur. In the initial stage of closing, the top 2 latch rollers should contact at the same time. The door fares when closed and latched. The clearance at the end of the latch cam meets requirements. Recheck the guide arm for preload. Open the door to the cocked position and remove the nut at the guide arm bolt common to the support bracket. After closing and latching the door, try to move the 3/8" bolt up and down. If the bolt can be moved, the guide arm is not preloaded and the final guide arm length is set. If the bolt cannot be moved, loosen the jam nuts and adjust the length of the guide arm to eliminate the preload. Check again to be sure that the bolt can be moved vertically. When the adjustments are complete, tighten the nut on the guide arm connecting bolt. Torque the jam nuts per maintenance manual. Position the heat shrinkable sleeve with the drain holes pointed down and heat shrink the sleeve around the jam nuts. The next adjustment is the door stop pins. The objective is to obtain the proper clearance between the door stop pins and the stop pads on the body. On stop pins that can be accessed with the door closed, close and latch the door. Extend each stop pin to just touch the stop pad. Back off the stop pin 1/2 turn. Open the door. Lightly coat the stop pins with Vaseline or similar grease. Place modeling clay on all stop pads. Close and latch the door, then open the door. Check that the thickness of the modeling clay at the stop pin impression is per the maintenance manual. Rotate the stop pins as needed to get the correct thickness of modeling clay at the impression. Repeat this step as needed after each stop pin adjustment. The modeling clay impression records the maximum outboard movement of the door stop pins. As the latches go over center on the final latching, the door moves slightly inboard. After the proper clearance is obtained, open the door and rotate the stop pin until the nearest locking groove in the pin lines up with the locking groove in the bushing. Install the pin retainer springs in the locking grooves on each pin. Wipe the surfaces of all stop pins and stop pads to remove any modeling clay or other debris and lightly grease. Seal the stop pin holes on the forward stops at locations 3, 4, 5, and 6 with BMS 5-95 after final adjustment to prevent pressure leaks and noise. The next adjustment is to the upper and lower gates. Note the components of the latch torque tube subassemblies are similar but are not necessarily interchangeable. Be careful not to mix up similar components between doors. Start with the door closed and the latch and gate push rods connected to the latch torque tube. Position the interior handle in the door latched position. Adjust the lower gate first, then the upper gate. Remove the bolt, washer, bushing, and nut to disconnect the gate push rod from the gate. Rotate the gate to the closed position with the gate bearing against the door threshold. Adjust the gate push rod to connect to the gate. Adjust the push rod to the nearest 1/2 turn of the rod end. Insert a 5/1000 inch thick shim between the gate and the threshold. The gate is in the proper position when the shim cannot be pulled out. Adjust the gate push rod as required in 1/2 turn increments. Install the bolt, washer, bushing, and nut to connect the push rod to the gate crank. Tighten to the recommended torque value. Tighten the jam nut on the adjustable rod. Repeat for the upper gate. Attach a spring scale to the door interior handle at a point 12 inches from the center of the handle shaft. It should take 17 pounds force or less to unlatch the door. It should take 38 pounds of force or more to latch the door. Be sure to measure the forces perpendicular to the interior handle throughout the entire latching or unlatching motion. If a torque wrench is used instead of a scale, the torque values are 200 inch-pounds or less to unlatch and 450 inch-pounds or more to latch the door. If the forces are not within these limits, adjust upper gate push rod. Lengthening the push rod will increase the handle torque about 40 to 70 inch-pounds per 1/2 turn. The next adjustment is the door centering guide. The objective is for the centering guide to smoothly and freely enter the guide track on the body as the door is closed. Check dimensions A and B to see if adjustment is needed. Adjust gap A between the centering guide and the guide track rub strip by moving the centering guide fitting up or down on the serrated plate as needed. Adjust gap B as needed by exchanging washers between the guide side and the nut side of the guide fitting. This requires removing the guide fitting to access the nut. Tighten the nut on the centering guide enough to prevent the guide from rotating. Perform a second check of the door skin-to-body flushness at the top, bottom, and sides of the door. If the flushness requirements are not met, readjust the latch cams. The rest of this module will discuss the door mechanism adjustments. The next adjustment is the exterior handle. Use the exterior handles to open the door to the cocked position. Check to see that the exterior handles automatically stow in the door pan recess with the door in the cocked position. Adjust the length of the horizontal push rod, if necessary, to allow the exterior handles to stow. The exterior handles should rotate 180 degrees and retract when the roller bearing aligns with the slots in the basket cam. If the handles rotate less than 180 degrees, move the guide arm support bracket forward on the serrated plate. This will increase the door torque tube and door handle rotation. If the support bracket is moved, check the guide arm again for preload. Next, adjust the door emergency mechanism. The door emergency mechanism adjustments apply to the disarm cable, the emergency power assist trigger pin mechanism, the linkage between the mode selector lever and the girt bar handling mechanism, and the mode select lockout mechanism. Note that the adjustment procedures are different for each door. This module will show door 1 left. Rig pins PD2 through PD9 are used in this procedure. When adjusting the disarm cable for the passenger doors, the objective is to remove the slack to be sure that the disarm cable will pull the mode selector lever to the detached position when the external handles are butterflied to open the door. The initial rigging is done with the system set in the engaged mode. The mode selector lever is positioned to the engaged mode, and a 3/16" diameter rig pin is inserted through the rigging hole in the handle base into the hole in the housing. After the rig pin is inserted, adjust the push rod A between the handle housing crank and the trigger pin crank. The length of push rod A is adjusted as required to obtain a minimum travel of 7/10 inch for the trigger pin. The trigger pin should be in full contact with the trigger on the upper hinge assembly when the pin is extended. Insert a 1/4 inch rig pin through the girt bar mechanism support bracket and crank. If the rig pin cannot be inserted because of misalignment of the rig pin holes in the slider cam and bracket, adjust the length of the connecting push rods C and D between the crank and the mode select lever housing as needed to align the 2 holes. This procedure positions the actuating bell crank in the engaged mode. The disarm cable is adjusted while holding the external handles in the fully butterflied position. Loosen nut B on the disarm cable support bracket. Turn the cable terminal in the housing and tighten nut A at the same time. When the cable terminal can no longer be turned with finger pressure, the slack has been removed from the cable. Tighten nut A 1 extra turn to preload the cable. Tighten nut B and secure A and B with lock wire. Check that the dimensions from the edge of the cable terminal to the face of the ball on the end of the cable are within tolerance. To check the cable preload, relax the force on the external handles. Fully butterfly the handles and check for movement of the mode selector lever crank. There should be a slight movement of the mode selector lever crank, but no movement in the girt bar cranks. With the exterior handles fully butterflied, pull the cable aft lightly to be certain that there is no slack. Push forward and aft on the cable terminal to be sure that no play remains in the cable. Next, adjust the girt bar mechanism. The girt bar and girt bar sliders are positioned in the floor fittings. The position of the floor fittings is adjusted with the door mode selector lever placed in the engaged position. It should be noted that any adjustment to the latch cams will require checking of the girt bar, slider, and floor fitting alignment. Close and latch the door. Cycle the mode selector and visually verify the smooth engagement of sliders into the lifter and floor fittings. Reposition floor fittings on the inboard-outboard serrations for the smoothest engagement and disengagement. Check the overlap of the girt bar sliders and floor fittings. The gaps between the girt bar and the floor fitting should be approximately equal at each end of the girt bar. Gap tolerance should be within 3/100ths minimum to 9/100ths maximum. To adjust the spacing of the girt bar lifters, center the girt bar between the floor fittings. The faces of the girt bar lifters should line up with the slider stop faces on the girt bar. The dimension between the faces of the girt bar lifters should be per maintenance manual. These adjustments are made at the same time as the adjustments to the girt bar crank push rods. To adjust the girt bar crank push rods, place the mode selector lever to the detach position. Rotate the girt bar cranks to their full detach position up against the girt bar lifters. Install the girt bar push rods, adjusting the length as required to pick up the girt bar crank and the center drive crank. Adjust the length of the push rods that connect the center drive crank with the girt bar crank to obtain the proper travel of the forward and aft girt bar cranks that activate the slider fittings. Minimum travel will depend upon airplane effectivity. Consult the maintenance manual for the correct adjustment. An interference check between the girt bar crank push rods and links is done with the door closed and latched. To eliminate interference, increase the radius rod length per the manual, then turn the adjustment screw on the link 3 to 6 turns clockwise. To prevent rotational binding of the push rods as the gate is raised, set the rod ends on the girt bar crank push rods at slight angles opposite to each other. Check that no rotational binding occurs by making sure the push rods can be rotated through some small angle at either extreme position of the gate, either with the gate raised or lowered. The vertical setting of the cam on the girt bar crank is set by adding or subtracting shim washers. Refer to the maintenance manual for the required clearance. After adjustment, place the mode selector lever to engage. Position the girt bar crank in the engaged position. Align the cam on the slider and rotate the stud until it bottoms in the cam. Tighten the stud lock nut to 10 to 15 pound-inches while holding the stud in position with an Allen wrench. Move the mode selector lever to detach and check that the girt bar slider travel meets the minimum travel requirements in the maintenance manual. Operate the mode selector lever several times to be certain the girt bar sliders are operating properly. Next, adjust the lockout cam. The objective is to position the lockout cam to prevent moving the mode selector lever when the door is unlatched. With the door in the closed and latched position, place the door mode selector into the detach position. The lockout cam should be aligned with the lockout blade. To adjust, loosen the attach bolt and adjust the lockout cam forward or aft on the serrated plate on the lower latch torque tube. Finger tighten the bolt until the final adjustment is made. Check the gap between the lockout blade and the lockout cam. The required gap should be from 3 to 8/100ths. If the gap exceeds this limit, replace the lockout cam with the optional cam. To check the lockout cam adjustment, open the door by operating the interior handle and allow the door to move 3 to 5 inches inboard. Try to arm the system by operating the mode selector handle. The lockout cam should block the motion of the crank and prevent movement to the engaged position. If the cam position is satisfactory, tighten the bolt on the lockout cam. Next, check the fixed pin. Verify that the emergency power actuator reservoir is not installed. Place the mode selector lever in the detach position. With the guard installed, it is impossible to manually rotate the emergency power system trigger to the engaged position if the door has been opened more than a few degrees. In order to position the trigger to the engaged position, to functionally test the fixed pin installation, follow these steps. Use the outside handle to open the door a few degrees, only enough to access the trigger from outside of the plane. Use a screwdriver to apply pressure to the trigger to move it to the engaged position. The over-center spring should hold the trigger in this position. Open the door to the full inboard position. Do not rotate the door out of the cutout. Note that the trigger is now in the engaged position. Now continue with the functional test of the fixed pin. Return the door to its fully closed and latched position. As the door closes, the fixed pin should cycle the trigger to the detached position. Open the door to expose the trigger assembly. Verify that the fixed pin on the door structure sequenced the trigger assembly fully back to the detached position. If the trigger assembly is not sequenced fully back to the detached position, determine if binding exists in the trigger housing assembly. It is possible that there may be binding at the trigger pivot point and/or at the spring cartridge pivot point. This binding could prevent the fixed pin from properly sequencing the trigger. Next, check the emergency power system trigger guard. First, perform the detach mode check. Place the door mode selector in the detach position and open the door fully with the inside handle. Try to manually move the emergency power trigger from the detach to the engage position. The guard attached to the upper hinge link on the body torque tube should prevent the trigger from being manually moved to the engaged position. Check for adequate clearance of the roller retainer bolt with the body skin, and door frame cutout during a complete door opening and closing cycle. The minimum clearance must be 5/100ths with the body and door skin and 15/100ths with the door frame cutout. Trim the door if necessary to meet these clearance requirements. The clearance of the bolts attaching the guard to the hinge link will be 5/100ths of an inch during the door opening and closing cycle. Now perform the engage mode check. Place the door mode selector in the engage position and open the door far enough to visually check that the emergency power system trigger has been positioned by the sear pin to the engaged position. Close the door and return the mode selector to the detach position. Adjust the emergency power spring cylinder. This procedure applies to the emergency power spring cylinder at the upper end of the actuation cable of the emergency powered door opening system. Using a tool to apply a constant 35-pound preload to the cable, verify the cable travel to be per maintenance manual while the door is operated in the emergency mode using the interior main handle only. Connect the cable terminal to the reservoir trigger lever and tighten the bolt and nut per maintenance manual. Caution: any adjustment to the guide arm will affect the cable travel. This completes the rigging of the Boeing 757 passenger door. We have adjusted the vertical positioning of the door, guide arm length, forward and aft positioning of the torque tubes, latch cams, door stop pins, upper and lower gate, centering guide, and guide arm preload check. Also, the exterior handle mechanism, the emergency power mechanism, and the girt bar mechanism have also been adjusted. Complete rigging procedures are located in the 757 maintenance manual. A properly rigged door is easier to operate and contributes to a safe airplane.